We're on the cusp of 3 huge JRPG remakes dropping in 2024, with a possible 4th one if Square Enix can get their act together. So in the spirit of that, I want to celebrate by counting down my top 10 JRPG remakes of all time. So the order might be a little surprising, but hopefully as the video goes on and we go through the list, my reasons will make more sense to you. Or maybe they won't and you'll let me know in the comments. Before we dive into the list, I wanted to let you know that this video's sponsor, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, is dropping on January 26th and is available for pre-order right now on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. And to fill you in on all the details, let me kick it over to Drewski.
Welcome to paradise.
Aloha! All right! I can show you around now. But there's a few things you need to learn before we have a good time.
You can have a little fun with some friends. And even pick up a new skill. Whatever you do, be careful. Even paradise can have its secrets.
You trying to tell me there are Yakuza in Hawaii?
Not exactly something you'd find in a guidebook, is it?
Keep your friends close. And your enemies closer.
Name's Dwight.
Nice to meet you.
Take cover!
Now starting off, we have Lunar Silver Star Harmony. Now this was the remake for the PlayStation Portable, and it was also on mobile later. Now, from what I can tell, this isn't a really super popular game. Every time I bring it up on the channel, people always, they're not super happy with it. But to me, this is a personal favorite because it was one of the games that got me back into JRPGs. And as a remake, I think it's excellent. It has an all new hand-drawn visual art style that looks excellent, a rearranged soundtrack that I think sounds great, and some brand new voice acting that totally elevates it from the original release. But one thing that it did keep that I appreciate is those animated cutscenes. Those are excellent. Now, it also adds some new wrinkles to combat. For the most part, it remains largely the same. However, each character now has some kind of like super move to spice things up. And overall, I found that the combat was much easier. This game is very special to me. I'll always appreciate it, and it's one of my favorite remakes. Now, one of the most random JRPG remakes and revivals was Live Alive. Now, this was an obscure Super Nintendo JRPG that the West never got. However, it was brought to life in a beautiful way in this remake. Instead of doing a full 3D remake, they decided to utilize the HD 2D art style that they started with Octopath Traveler. And to me, it just fits perfect. It looks incredible with new 3D environments, the way the particle effects work with attacks. It just looks awesome in that HD 2D style. Also, there's a newly arranged soundtrack that sounds amazing, plus voice acting that obviously wasn't in the original game. On top of that, there's tons of great new additions. You now have a radar or a little mini map in the corner that always tells you where to go, so you'll never get lost, which I really appreciate. There's an updated user interface that just makes playing the game way more tolerable, plus a totally rebalanced combat system. Now, what I do appreciate is that they didn't mess with the overall design. The game holds up pretty well in that respect. Due to its saga-esque design where you play as all these different characters and then they come together at the end, it all holds up really well. All the scenarios are fairly short, maybe like 6-7 hours tops, so you can really fly through them and just get going. And what was kind of surprising to me is how well the combat still held up. It is turn-based, but still, even on that like sort of pseudo strategy RPG combat, it's excellent. Now, I'm not sure what Square Enix expected sales-wise from this game. I think it sold maybe like 500,000 copies, maybe close to 1 million by now. It's definitely more of a cult hit, but if you love games like this, then you gotta check it out. Now we're finally getting to the first game on this list that probably needed a remake the most, and that is Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. The original game, titled Fire Emblem Gaiden, was not only a really weird game with a lot of interesting design choices, but was also on the original Nintendo and is pretty archaic by today's standards. Now when you play Shadows of Valentia, obviously the first thing you notice is the visual upgrade. It's much more in line with the 3DS Fire Emblem titles and looks pretty good. They also added voice acting and some really beautiful anime cutscenes. Now as far as the gameplay changes go, the original game was very very punishing, and they added a ton of new things here to make it more playable. First and foremost, obviously, is they added a casual mode, so no more permadeath if you don't want it, which I love. It makes the game much more tolerable. Also, from a story perspective, they added a new prologue, so you kind of get a more feel for Alm and Celica's story. You can see how they grew up together, which I appreciate. They added Mila's turn wheel, which essentially lets you rewind turns. I love that in strategy RPGs because sometimes you can really mess up a turn and really mess up the entire battle. So the fact that you don't have to start all the way from the beginning is really nice. There's also a weapon forging system that's really cool. And also they added a bonus 6th chapter that's after the end of the game. And of course, if you have some amiibos, you can unlock new dungeons and summon some more monsters. It's kind of shocking how playable this remake is compared to the original. That game was only the second one in the series, but it removed things like the weapon triangle and had some interesting design choices like explorable dungeons and towns. But now it's actually really fun. It feels more like a traditional JRPG, but just with strategy RPG battles. Overall, it's a really great game and considered one of the favorites amongst hardcore Fire Emblem fans, and you should definitely give it a try if you haven't. Now, you might be really surprised to see Final Fantasy VII Remake so low on this list, considering how much I love it and how I usually have it really high on lists, but allow me to explain. When Final Fantasy VII Remake is recreating iconic moments and firing on all cylinders, it's better than perfect. The boss battles are absolutely epic, including the first one with the Guard Scorpion. It's absolutely insane. But then there's also really awesome moments like going to Aerith's house for the first time and how you interact with characters. Like Barrett, for example, is just so much more interesting and fleshed out, and same with Aerith. And of course, in my opinion, the best part in the entire game, Wall Market, not only did they recreate it in really beautiful ways, but they added to it and made it even better. And I think that's when Final Fantasy Remake is at its best, is when it's creating new things that are better and add to the game, especially things like Jessie and going to visit her house and how you get to spend more time with her. And obviously, there's some really positive things like the upgrade in visuals. It looks incredible. Every character looks exactly like I imagined they would. And that rearranged soundtrack is one of my favorites of all time. But now we get into why this game is so low on the list, and that is because there's some scenarios that really drag. One scenario that comes to mind is when you're turning off all the sun lamps. It's very confusing, it's very maze-like, and I just really hated it. It was annoying. Same with the train graveyard and the sewers. It just felt like those parts really dragged, and they were stretching them out as long as possible. Not to mention they do change the story in some ways, some for the good, some for the bad. And if you've played the game, you know that this is almost in some ways a sequel rather than a remake, despite what the name is of the game itself. That all said, it's still amazing. It's like one of my favorite games of all time, and I can't wait to see what they do with the upcoming Rebirth. And speaking of Final Fantasy, let's talk about the Pixel remasters. These are games that desperately needed remakes, and I know a lot of people may not consider them remakes. I mean, it's in the name, remasters, but you know what? It's my list, so I don't really care. Now, some of the older Final Fantasies are beyond unplayable. Try playing OG Final Fantasy 1. It's just awful. So all these enhancements make those games much more playable and actually fun. You can speed up the combat to make it more fun. You have the ability to increase the amount of gil and experience you get, so you don't have to sit there and grind over and over. And I played through them all in 2023, and it was just so fun to finally be able to go through those games in a tolerable way. Of course, there are updated visuals, but it's debatable on whether or not it's better, because they're not exactly, HD 2D remake visuals. They're kind of more enhanced pixels. And there's also newly arranged soundtracks, but what's cool is you can play the old ones if you want. Now, why these aren't higher is because unfortunately one thing they really couldn't fix was the design of these games. One of my biggest problem with these old RPGs is it's really hard to figure out where you're supposed to go next. There's obviously no marker on the map, and a lot of times the game doesn't even tell you what you're supposed to do next. You kind of just wander around aimlessly. I was always playing with a guide with these games just because I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And despite what some might say, I feel like if you bundle them all together, it's a pretty great value for what you get with all of these games. Now, that all said, it would be nice if we could get true ground up remakes in, say, the HD 2D style. I mean, can you imagine Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy VI in HD 2D? One can dream. Now, probably the game that needed a remake the least on this entire list was Super Mario RPG, but despite that, it still sits really high on this list because of what it did to fix a great game and make it even better. Obviously, we have the updated visuals. They look amazing. It still remains pretty faithful to that original style, but obviously it upgrades it for modern consoles, and it runs at a silky smooth 60 frames per second. We also have a rearranged soundtrack that I think is crucial to the experience. I mean, if you play this game with the sound off, I feel like you're totally missing what makes this game great. And in terms of actual game gameplay stuff, the game overall is less grindy. You can kind of mainline this game without fighting a lot of enemies, and you can be properly leveled. Also, you can actually fast travel instead of having to go city by city to go all the way through these different levels, so that makes it much more tolerable. Plus, you have these new team up attacks that are all different depending on what your party makeup is, so I thought that was really neat. Now, because of some of these enhancements, the game is probably like almost 10 hours shorter, but I think it's a much tighter experience. And me personally, I would rather have a game that's tighter and shorter than long and drawn out and not as fun. Now, one reason why this game isn't higher on this list, and one thing that they didn't fix, and I don't know if they could have fixed, was the platforming. Some of the platforming in this game is just so annoying, and I think the problem is because it's from an isometric perspective, so it's really hard to judge jumps. I can't tell you how many times I would fail a jump just because I couldn't tell how far I needed to jump or what I was really supposed to do. It got really, really annoying, and it would have been nice if they could have found a way to fix that. That all said, it's an amazing game, definitely one of the best classic JRPGs, and now one of the best JRPG remakes. Star Ocean: The Second Story R is not only one of 2023's best games, but now stands as one of the best JRPG remakes of all time. That HD 2D visual art style does a lot of heavy lifting and is a huge reason why this game is so high on the list. The original game doesn't look bad, but my god, does it look incredible with this new art style. And what's cool is it finds a way to stay faithful while using those same original sprite designs, but adding beautiful new lighting and a breathtaking new world to explore. It was just jaw-droppingly gorgeous, and I loved every time I got to a new town. I just loved exploring every little corner. There's also new character portraits. You could use the old ones if you wanted to, but there's new ones, new voice acting, rearranged soundtracks, so all the bells and whistles you would expect. And there's also a ton, and I mean a ton of new gameplay enhancements, big and small, that I don't have enough time to list them all, but a few that really make a big difference is one, auto-saving. Obviously, a lot of classic JRPGs, you have to go to a save point, but here it has auto-saving. You can actually fast travel between towns, so it saves a lot of time. There's also more overworld activities, so you can go around, find treasures, get into fights and stuff like that. You can now call in characters into combat, which adds a totally new wrinkle to combat. And what's fun is it adds characters from other Star Ocean games, so it's sort of a celebration of the whole series in a way. Not to mention a laundry list of other little things that make it more playable. Now, I really wanted to put this higher, maybe even number one, but I just couldn't because of how bad some of the designs for the dungeons are. There's a couple dungeons in this game where I almost turned the game off and stopped playing because they were so annoying. Genuinely some of the worst JRPG dungeons I've ever played. That said, the positives totally outweigh the negatives, and this stands as an amazing game. And if you like classic JRPGs, you gotta play this remake. Now, one JRPG series that's infamous for doing a ton of remakes is the Pokemon franchise, but really the only remakes that could have made this list were Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Seeing the Johto region make the leap from 2D to 3D on the DS was so incredible. It had this brand new cozy vibe, so much more colorful. It looked amazing. Now, it would have been nice if they could have updated those MIDI style sound effects, but they ended up using those for years to come, so I guess it's not that big of a deal. And of course, you have those classic starters, Cyndaquil, Chikorita, and Totodile. Totodile being my personal favorite. But what's cool is there's a lot of interesting things they added. For one, they had these timed events back in the day. Obviously, a lot of that isn't available now, but at the time it was really cool. They had new mini games that you could partake in that made for some really fun situations and just added to the experience overall. You can have Pokemon follow you like Pokemon Yellow. I mean, it was only one, but still, it was really cool. I love little flourishes like that. And they added the entire Kanto region for the game, so it's almost like they remade two games in one. This is just a jam-packed game full of value, and the fact that you can go to two different regions and, you know, get all these different badges, it was just amazing. And also, every game came with something called a Pokewalker. It was kind of like a Tamagotchi-like item where you could take Pokemon with you and play a little minigame on this little device. Again, much like some of those timed events, it's probably not super relevant now, but back in the day, it was really, really neat. Heart Gold and Soul Silver might not only be the best Pokemon remakes of all time, but might just be straight up the best Pokemon games ever made. Now, I think a lot of people look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition as a remaster, but to me, it's one of the most impressive remakes of all time. Obviously, what grabs you right away is the visual upgrade. I mean, the original Wii game is rough to look at, so the fact that it's not only tolerable, but beautiful is awesome. On top of that, it has tons of other great enhancements like an updated soundtrack, better user interface so you can see what you're doing in combat and exploration. The Colony 6 reconstruction was made way easier. You have more difficulty options that make make for a better experience overall. Plus, something that I love that they added was fashion equipment. Instead of just having that same attire for each character, you can kind of change what they look like. Depending on what gear you equip, it'll change how the character looks. I just love stuff like that. But to me, the single biggest enhancement and what makes this game so high on this list is the map design. Not just the map design, but the overall user interface and everything that goes into exploring this world. Exploring the world in the original Wii version was such a chore. It was so hard to figure out where you're supposed to go. And what was so shocking is when I looked at completion times, the definitive edition can be beat in almost 20 fewer hours compared to the Wii version. And it's really only because of the map and how much easier it is to explore and how much easier it is to get around. I mean, to me, that is a sign of a great remake when it totally gets rid of the flaws of the original and makes the game more playable. I don't have as much time to play games these days, so the fact that you can play a tighter experience and get rid of all the fluff is amazing. And on top of that, they added an entire new epilogue called Future Connected that takes place a year after the events of the original game. And it's like 15 to 20 hours. It's like its own game. That's incredible. Overall, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is one of the best games on Nintendo Switch, one of the best JRPG remakes of all time, but I couldn't put it at number one because really, there's only one game that I had to put on this list as number one. And at the tippy top at number one, I've got Trials of Mana, and I can't wait for the comments on this one, but hear me out. Obviously, Trials of Mana originally was a 16-bit Super Nintendo RPG, but we never got it in the West until Collection of Mana. Now, it's a fun game. It's a 2D kind of like hack and slash action RPG, but obviously that's very different from a full 3D game. But then here comes this gorgeous looking remake in 2020. It's beautifully remade in full 3D. However, it still remains faithful to that original design, not only in, picking the different characters and how you start the game, but also just the general design of the levels. And it keeps that original charm, even down to weird things like those dancing shopkeepers. Yes, those were in the original game. But what's really impressive is that it manages to modernize the combat and make it fun for all 6 characters. It's not easy to take a game that's in 2D and translate it into 3D, and every character was unique and super fun. Yes, even Shawit. But to me, what's most impressive and why I put it at number one is that it single-handedly revived the Mana franchise. I think there were so many people that had never played this franchise before, but jumped in with this remake and loved it. And I'm one of them. I've never played a Mana game before this game. And the game sold incredibly well, and now because of that, we're getting the first new Mana game in over 15 years with Visions of Mana. When a remake can not only faithfully bring an old game up to modern standards in a good way, but also revitalize said franchise, there's really nothing more impressive than that. Now, these are the 10 best JRPG remakes so far, but there's more on the way in 2024. And to see them and other great JRPGs set to drop in 2024, make sure you check out this video right here. And special thanks to Reset Switch, Tyler Kuzawa, and the Miyazaki Man for supporting me over on Patreon. To get exclusive videos and other cool perks, consider supporting me over on patreon.com/thegaming shelf. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.